Brilliant. I take that as a yes. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Great to see so many people trickling in. I can tell you there's certainly more people on this webinar than the previous webinar I was on. My name's Sonia Dunlop. I'm a senior policy advisor at E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism. We're a global climate change think tank working on many different issues, including sustainable finance and international financial institutions and public banks in particular, working on how those institutions can lead the climate change transition we need to get to what we call a climate safe world. This webinar is to really talk about the role of the biggest and most famous, well, not necessarily the biggest, the most famous of those public banks, the multilateral development banks, to build back better, and their role in building back better after and in response to this COVID-19 economic and health crisis that has really shaken our world. So thank you so much for joining. This is part of London Climate Action Week, a week-long series of events that E3G masterminded for the first time last year, where we're really trying to bring together the community of people in London and across the world working on all these different aspects of the transition to a climate safe world, and try to bring them together to have conversations to really move the dial forward on a whole series of key issues. And I think just to say a few words in terms of introduction before I introduce all our lovely panelists, is just that I really think we are very aware here at E3G that the response to the COVID-19 recovery really is the biggest game in town, that we're facing not just a single challenge, but really a triple challenge and a triple crisis of the need for a greener recovery, the need to really tackle the debt crisis, and the need to really make the COP26 UNFCCC climate conference in Glasgow next year a financial success. And we really see multilateral development banks as having a crucial role within that. And we're really keen to have so many of them represented here. We want to talk about what are the reforms, what are the tools, what needs to happen in order to meet that challenge, and talk about, you know, what are the internal and external, short-term and long-term changes that need to be put in place in order to make sure that our public banks, all our public banks, really lead the way in terms of a greener, better, more just and more resilient recovery to the COVID crisis. So our first speaker is Norbert Gorham, who is Deputy Director General of the International Climate Policy at the German Ministry of Environment. He is someone who's been very active and vocal in this space for a long time, working for the German Environment Ministry, BMU, within the German government, obviously one of the big shareholders of many of the multilateral development banks. So always very interesting to hear what he has to say. So Norbert, maybe if I can hand over to you to kick us off, and then we'll move to our panel with the rest of the panelists. Norbert, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Sonia. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks also for inviting me to kick this discussion off here. I'm very delighted to be here in this London Climate Week event, and also delighted to see many familiar faces, including Amelie and Gaia. Nancy, I can't see you, but I hope I will see you soon. So year 2020 and the COP in Glasgow are absolutely crucial for the delivery of our climate finance promises. Our means here the promises of developed countries who have promised to mobilize 100 billion annually by 2020 and through to 2025. Our partners in the Global South are expecting predictable, reliable funding to implement their climate commitments and be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and bilateral and multilateral finance, including the multilateral funds, have to contribute to that. But the recent report of the OECD identified so far that in 2018 we have reached only about less than 80 billion. And it's hard to meet the target by the end of this year. We don't know the exact numbers yet. 30 billion of that are coming from MDBs. And I think what is in particular important is that the mobilized private finance, where MDBs and development finance institutions should play a big role, is only delivering 15 billion out of that 80 billion. So that is to some extent disappointing. The global pandemic demonstrated the fragility of development gains, particularly with views to developing countries' financial resilience to external shocks, and in the consequence, their fiscal space shrinked. The exchange rates are getting worse. Remittances are not coming in the same way as they did. Capital is flying out of the countries, and it leads to increased debt. And so we have, in addition to the needs of the treasuries in the countries to provide funding for relief and for the social and economic recovery, also an increasing indebtedness. Thus, the long-term policy gains, such as mitigation greenhouse gas emissions, but also adaptation to climate change and preventing biodiversity loss, are often put on hold. And that's due to the fact that the costs are perceived being too high. We can talk about that, whether they are really too high, but this is still an argument we hear very often. Capital costs for sure are very expensive for developing countries, are getting more expensive, and the priorities for the countries, as I already said, are different. So in that context, delivering on climate commitments is still crucial, because climate finance is the glue of the Paris Agreement. It puts it all together. Without delivering the climate finance as expected, we cannot expect that the new round of NDCs, which have to be submitted this year to the UNFCCC, will provide the additional ambition we are expecting. This will only become true if developing countries will receive predictable, reliable, and quality funding, which helps them to address those needs, also growth and sustainability. In order to address the triple change you mentioned, Sonja, green recovery, debt crisis, and the mobilization of finance for climate and biodiversity, we need, in my view, four things. First, international solidarity. Developed countries are at the moment doing whatever it takes. Developing countries only do whatever they can. So there is a mismatch, and we need to work together to overcome that, to overcome the health crisis, restart global economy towards a more resilient, just, and low vulnerabilities of the pandemic. The problems have to be taken together. The rhetoric of building back better, of a green recovery, has to be materialized. But also, the second point is MDBs need very clear political guidance from all of their shareholders. This is difficult because developing MDBs are listening not only to their shareholders, they also have to listen to their clients. And the interests of clients and shareholders are not always the same. The urgency of some of the actions to be taken by MDBs are not always aligned, and thus we need shareholders also within the banks itself. So if you look to the banks, and we have all the practitioners here, we can talk much better about it than I. You also have organizational issues there. On the one hand, you have the horizontal units which serve the sectors, which serve needs of climate, environment, sustainability. But on the other hand, you have country desks and country offices in the countries, and you cannot expect that this is always leading in the same direction. So, as I said, what is needed is clear political guidance, and I will name one bank where we can see that at the moment, which is the EIB. The EIB just has adopted, or the board of the EIB, its climate bank roadmap. Just to name the EIB now a climate bank is already something. But I think this is not just naming, it is also reality with very clear commitments. The bank strives to be aligned completely to 1.5-degree pathway. It will apply shadow prices of 250 euros per ton by 2030 and 800 by 2050. It will provide at least 50% of its climate finance of its overall funding in form of climate finance by 2025. So I think the IIB, in our view, really serves as a benchmark, and it's one of the really surprising examples of leadership from just recently. My third point is we may look at MDBs and IFIs, to what extent they have the capital base they need in order to address the crisis which are unfolding. MDBs and IFIs are important element of effective multilateralism. They have demonstrated that they have the fiscal power to for counter-cyclical finance and debt raise. And just a week ago, the G20 finance ministers extended the debt service suspension initiative, and we'll come back to that next year during the World Bank and IMF spring meetings. And in my view, that offers a hook to think about whether we can link the restructuring of debt with sustainability, with biodiversity, with climate. There are a number of initiatives already on the way who are developing proposals and concrete ideas, and that could be taken up perhaps in the future. My last point is global leadership on green recovery. Already the G20 this year started to discuss about that, which has to be commended. But looking for the years to come, in particular next year with the G7 presidency UK and the G20 presidency Italy, offers new opportunities with the incoming Biden administration. Hopefully we have a strong US partner, and we then perhaps can start a conversation about how to strengthen the international financial system in a way that it is really able to deliver on green recovery, debt issues, and strong international collaboration. Thank you.
I think that's absolutely right. We really do need that global leadership, and we need that clear political guidance from all shareholders to these institutions, and that needs to be in concert with similar messages coming from clients. Absolutely. So thank you so much for that scene-setting intervention. Maybe now I think we should move to the panel. We have lots of really distinguished panelists with a lot of experience in this area to really talk about what is the role of the 9 and more leading MDBs in this space. What are the key moments next year to really kind of shape this narrative, and how can we ensure that the Global South is really not forgotten in all of this? And I first want to turn to Amalie Armin, who is Director of Climate Change at CDC Group in the UK, but is also an advisor to the COP26 presidency team. And Amalie, but of course, Amalie also has a distinguished background in the Inter-American Development Bank, in the UK government, and also working for an excellent climate change think tank called E3G. So I wanted to ask, what do you think we need in order to make the UK G7, the Italian G20, to make all the key sort of moments next year, including COP26, a financial success, and how can what role do the MDBs play in that financial success and the need to make everything around a green recovery? So Amalie, over to you.
Thanks, Sonia, and thanks, Norbert. And great to be invited to join this discussion. So, as we look to 2021, it's absolutely essential that we move beyond the rhetoric, as I think was referred to in terms of Build Back Better. This is a once in a century historic opportunity to ensure that we really do align public finance and the private sector resources in a way that ensures we really move onto a path that is consistent with what everyone wants and actually needs to be able to live decent lives on our planet. And so, ensuring that green, resiliency, inclusivity as well, ensuring an inclusive recovery is built into the public sector and private sector response is going to be really critical, without a doubt. And so next year, of course, with the UK's leadership of the G7, the Italian leadership of the G20, and then, of course, COP26, provides a really essential opportunity to ensure that these different elements are coming together. And I think MDBs, Multilateral Development Banks, will be central to this, agenda, without a doubt. So Norbert mentioned the 100 billion climate finance. I won't say much more about that. Of course, it's really important, and MDBs have a very important role in that context. But I think what is also really needed now is much greater public-private collaboration to accelerate and scale up the investments that will support countries' objectives under the Paris Agreement, to ensure that all finance is aligned with those objectives for the Paris Agreement. And so, of course, on the transition to net zero, ensuring that public incentives, public policy, public finance are really incentivizing and directing private sector investment into what is needed for the low carbon transition, or the transition to net zero before 2050. And I think there's a number of tools that are really useful for this. I mean, first, the role of long-term strategies and 2050 plans, I think, are essential tools to help decision makers integrate the relevant climate, green, resilient and inclusive objectives ultimately into their economic and financial planning, into their macro and fiscal response to the COVID recovery. Where they don't exist, I think that there's still some a need to step up those and create that long-term vision. But it will be essential to ensure that the right incentives are built into the macroeconomic and fiscal response. Secondly, the important use of innovative use of financial instruments to accelerate the energy transition. We need to massively scale up renewables. We need to bring forward storage, need to invest in much smarter energy systems and electromobility. But also we need to accelerate more innovative technologies. And I think green hydrogen is extremely exciting, particularly for some of those harder to abate sectors to fully decarbonize, such as industrial feedstock or logistics. And then, of course, to prioritize nature-based solutions across all activities, particularly for infrastructure, but also recognizing the role of nature-based solutions in providing resiliency for communities as well. And lastly, I just want to emphasize one final point where we, of course, and it's wonderful to see all these commitments for reaching net zero by 2050 before, or in China's case, before 2060. And, hopefully we can minimize some of the, most catastrophic impacts of climate change by delivering on that, and perhaps even getting well before 2050 as the technologies come forward. But we know that we have to also accelerate the solutions for adaptation and resilience, and and that's why I think the MDBs have to continue playing a crucial role. I mean, it's essential to ensure that climate risk is assessed across all investments and activities, but also to step up support to governments so that climate risk and resiliency is integrated upstream, and importantly, create the right incentives for bringing forward the private sector, sharing risk and reward between and amongst public and private sector actors. The private sector is much better at managing risk. So how can governments, more effectively incentivize and ensure that the private sector does take on that risk, provides societal benefits, but also achieves a financial return. And I think another area, and this is something I'm seeing a lot, the need for in my role at CDC, we have to work with businesses to strengthen their own adaptive capacity. and ensure that resiliency is integrated into their business strategies, their business plans. Because if not, particularly when we look at what's happening with the task force on climate-related disclosure, it's going to be even harder to be able to attract private capital into those investments. And obviously the UK's announcement for mandatory disclosure of TCFD for all publicly listed companies and financial services from 2025, is a really positive move in the right direction. But it's equally important we need to work with businesses to ensure that they themselves can develop in a way, or can ensure their business models are fully resilient to climate. And lastly, and I'm sort of circling back almost to the 100 billion question, but in a slightly taking a slightly different perspective, it's really, I think, and I'm seeing it even more now in my role, but it was something I started to see a lot at IDB. We really have to get much smarter and better at how we assess climate resiliency and adaptation. Adaptation finance and climate finance are a good assessment of where we're reducing vulnerability, building adaptive capacity, let alone building in resiliency to climate impacts. So we do need new standards, a common set of standards and metrics to provide much greater transparency, which will be needed and required by investors who are increasingly concerned about being exposed to climate risk, both physical risk as well as, of course, transition risk, as you hear a lot about here in Europe in particular. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's a good summary of the different themes in many ways that the COP26 effort is trying to work on. Next, I want to turn to Gaia Larson, from a senior associate at the World Resources Institute, an organization we work with a lot, based in Washington, DC. Great to have you with us. And I just wanted to ask you to talk a bit more about how you see the role of these institutions in a greener, better recovery, how you think the COVID-19 crisis will impact the ability for these countries to adapt and build resilience to climate change, and also to talk a bit about that issue that Norbert mentioned of the shrinking fiscal space in many of these countries of the global south to really be able to invest in, and what are the changes that we could make in order to address that question. So Gaia, if you would just briefly, if you don't mind, try and address some of those points, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, so I thought I would bring in some concrete examples from some of the countries we're working with right now to try to help them figure out how to deal with these multiple shocks. Fiji, for example, it's a country where actually they were, by some metrics, quite successful when it came to COVID. They had 35 COVID cases and 2 deaths. But to stay that way and to get there, they had to shut down their borders. And Fiji is mostly reliant on tourism for a large portion of their economy. So that means that the Fiji's economy is projected to decrease by about 20% over this year. And employment is skyrocketing. And it means that the country has had to essentially sacrifice its economy in order to save the health of its people. So, it was a choice that they had to make. But unfortunately, it's one that they're now having to deal with going forward. Now, another country is Guatemala. We are currently working with the Ministry of Finance there as well. And Guatemala had 100 and some thousand cases of COVID. And to help reduce the spread of the virus there, they had to, like most countries around the world, put in place restrictions, including curfews and closing down the public transport system. In Guatemala, around 70% or so of the population works in the informal sector. And so they're living on a day-to-day basis. So this COVID crisis has meant that around 1 million more people are falling into poverty in Guatemala. And this is a country where already 60% of the people were below the poverty line. So it's real, and it's extremely difficult for countries to be dealing with. And these are just 2 random cases, not ones that are chosen because they're particularly seriously affected. Now, also at the same time, as we know, climate change continues. Fiji was hit by tropical cyclone Harold in April. Guatemala was just more recently hit with Hurricane Eta, and which has caused several villages to be covered, unfortunately, with landslides because of the way that the landscape has been damaged there. So it's quite dire. Now, in both of these countries, the governments have taken some action to try to invest in it's really more in the immediate sense, right, of sort of shoring up some of these losses for the people. So in Fiji, they had a COVID-19 response budget of around $500 million. And this was in March when, of course, we thought and hoped that the pandemic might be slower or shorter than it has turned out to be. And both of the countries have also increased their debt. So in Fiji, for example, the debt to GDP ratio is projected to be around 80% at the end of this year, which is double what it used to be before the pandemic. And it's causing the Fiji government there to become worried about whether their credit rating is going to be downgraded, making it even more difficult for them to access finance to deal with the multiple crises. In Guatemala, similarly, they've increased their lending. They use a lot of access the bond market a lot for their to increase their availability of finance, but also the IFIs. So, these we're looking at the situation that some of these countries are dealing with, and clearly there's a lot of work to be done to assist in trying to move forward these. But there's not a simple solution, unfortunately, right? And we have to work really diligently and hard to make sure that everybody who can contribute and who can help to deal with this crisis, which is really unprecedented, does so in the way that they can. So for the MDBs, they have multiple ways in which I think they can help and are doing so, and they can continue to do so. So everything from technical assistance, helping countries design paths forward that not only help them deal with the current immediate crisis, but do so in a way that doesn't fall into the temptation of investing in things that seem good now, but won't in the long term help the long-term climate and other resilience of the countries, right? So how do we make sure that countries are looking at the long-term resilience of any investments, not just, as Amelie was saying, the climate finance investments, but any investments? Like, how do you know that your lending or your expenditures now will be a benefit to the country in the future, and the infrastructure you're building, et cetera, will be resilient to future shocks. And I think, there's not really anything good that's come out of this pandemic, of course, but one thing that it does teach us, I think, is that things in the future will not be the same as they were in the past. And it's always tempting to think that things will stay the same. I think it's just a human nature that we have, right? It's hard for us to imagine that things in the future are going to be completely different, but I think this pandemic has brought that to reality, that actually we do need to plan for things in the future that are different than they are from today, and the climate change is the biggest example of how we need to do that. So in addition to helping, and both for the MDBs helping countries to understand that and to plan for that, I think they're also kind of more, perhaps not granular, but more different processes that the MDBs could be using. One thing is that there is a fair amount of emphasis, and there should be, on now increasing disaster risk finance and making sure that there is improved risk pooling, et cetera. But we also need to make sure that there's incentives when we do that for countries to invest upfront in resilience, and not just say, well, the insurance and the disaster risk finance will take care of it at the end, because we know that investing upfront is going to be ultimately the cheaper way of going about things. Another way is to think about how do we deal both with the adaptation and the mitigation side of things. They're deeply linked to each other. And then how do we deal with the debt crisis? And as Norbert was mentioning, I believe, how do we tie debt restructuring to some sort of emphasis on sustainability and on climate, debt for climate swaps, debt for sustainability swaps that can reward countries for investing in things that we all need countries to invest in, and at the same time help reduce the debt burden, particularly in cases where where the debt is unsustainable. So I will stop there because I know that we are short on time. But
and it was really great. Thank you so much, Gaia, to have those very specific examples that really help to illustrate the problem to all of us from Guatemala, from Fiji, and some ideas of what the solutions can be. And indeed, you mentioned, technical assistance. Amalie mentioned, talked a lot about adaptation and resilience. All of these things are things that E3G looks at in detail when it looks at the overall, Paris Agreement alignment of an MDB. And indeed, we published updated assessment of that just last week in the form of our online matrix. But now I'd like to turn to Gareth Phillips from the African Development Bank. You're one of the manager of climate and environmental finance in the climate change division in the AFDB, and it'd be really great to hear a bit from you, from your perspective from the African continent, on the impact that COVID-19 is having on climate resilience on the continent, what the role of the MDBs such as African Development Bank, but also others, should be in trying to remedy that, and what do you think the MDBs can do specifically to ensure green and resilient recovery plans in the different countries, and what are the incentives that you have in order to make that work? So Gareth, if you wouldn't mind just briefly for 5-6 minutes giving your thoughts on that would be great.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Sonia, and thank you for the invitation to be here this afternoon. I'll keep my video on, but if the sound gets interrupted, I'll turn it off. I'm sorry for the crows in the background. The African continent is the most vulnerable to climate change, and COVID-19 has certainly exacerbated that situation. But to be honest, during the same period, we've had locust plague in East Africa, we've had catastrophic floods at levels never seen before in Sudan, we've had the highest temperatures recorded in sub-Saharan Africa, and the year before we had record-breaking cyclones reaching inland to countries that have never experienced. The list goes on, and on top of that, we have endemic malaria, TB, HIV/AIDS, and Ebola never far away, waiting in the wings. What's different about COVID-19 is that it happens so rapidly, and whilst the number of cases has not been as high as predicted, perhaps with a couple of exceptions, the lockdowns that were imposed for a while impacted upon economic productivity. And of course, now with almost complete collapse of tourism and foreign investment, things are definitely getting worse. Most African economies are driven by micro, small and medium enterprises, and COVID has highlighted that governments don't have the ability to support these, let alone the informal sector and the unemployed. So with 600 million rain-fed farmers and no social safety net, COVID-19 really has given us a preview of how bad things could get. To ensure resilience and enhancing recovery, I think that we need to invest more in adaptation and resilience, and staying true to our strengthening commitment to align with the Paris Agreement. That means we need to start building resilience and adaptation pathways into long-term strategies. We need to identify unconditional and conditional adaptation activities in NDCs and strengthen the national adaptation plans and adaptation communications. These barely exist to date, and we really need a big effort to build those and get them in place. And we need finance to support doing that. In Africa, we have 54 countries, each of which have to have those documentations and strategies developed for them. And we need support to do that further. Moving, I think, to your second part about sort of the leverage. A lot of our leverage comes from the financing that we have to invest in our regional member countries, and particularly the approval processes that financing goes through. And Norbert mentioned the boards, and I think our boards play an incredibly important role in communicating the signals as to what needs to be invested in, and that's where we need to have the discussions between our board members, some of whom are donors and some of whom are recipients or clients of the bank. We also, exert leverage through the funding that we can mobilize from the multilateral climate funds, and very importantly, our ability to convene African leaders around common themes and to support the development of enabling environments. And I think that speaks a little bit to the building blocks, particularly building block 4 that some of you may be a bit familiar with, MDBs work to align with the Paris Agreement. But the challenge that we, or one of the main challenges that we face, is that there's insufficient funding coming from either the public or the private sector. Norbert quoted the OECD figures, and I'm quoting the latest CPI Global Finance Landscape, where they reported a mere $30 billion allocated to adaptation out of about $579 billion globally. So about 5% of that funding going to adaptation, with almost all of the balance going to mitigation. Now, for me, this highlights the lack of sustainable and reliable financing initiatives for adaptation and resilience. And actually, if you look at it, there are many policies and regulations that raise funding for mitigation. There's carbon taxes, levies, emissions trading schemes, and all sorts of things, which provide finance to support private sector investment into mitigation. But I can only think of 2 predictable and reliable sources of finance for adaptation. That's the Adaptation Fund and the 50% funding from the Green Climate Fund for adaptation. There are very few other reliable and predictable sources of finance for adaptation. And both of those 2 that I mentioned, they typically give grants to the public sector. They're not working with the private sector in adaptation. So what we think is that the developed country governments have not really adequately recognized that they and their consumers need to contribute to the costs of adapting to the impacts associated with the greenhouse gas emissions caused by the goods and services that they buy. Donors are relatively good at financing the mitigation component element of that statement, so the greenhouse gas emissions that are caused by the goods and services that we buy, but we don't have reliable financing instruments for the adaptation part of it. And the lack of these resources means that there are no reliable sources for funding or for building resilience and adaptation to climate change or COVID-19. And that's why the African Development Bank this year has had to cancel most of its investment projects and redirect $10 billion worth of finance into our COVID recovery fund. And that's why we see African economies increasingly having to divert their own resources into disaster recovery. So in short, I'm proposing that developed countries could use COP26 to send a clear signal that there is a reliable supply of financial support for adaptation resilience. Now, the second part of that challenge then is the private sector investment. And the African Development Bank is developing the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism, which is designed to use public sector funding from, for example, an adaptation levy to leverage private sector investment. Very briefly, you can think of that, you can think of the ABM as doing a similar service for adaptation as the Clean Development did for mitigation, but without the trading and speculation component. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that, but that difference, that makes a very significant difference to the way in which the private sector would engage with this mechanism, and it would address a lot of the unexpected outcomes that we experienced from the Clean Development Mechanism. So we're now piloting projects using Adaptation Benefit Mechanism, and we are raising funds for an African Adaptation Benefit Fund, which would sign offtake agreements for adaptation benefits, rather like the World Bank's Prototype Carbon Fund did in the early 2000s. And we hope to be able to announce significant progress on that at COP26. And finally, I'd like to second Amal Lee's view on the future role of green hydrogen. I think this is a very exciting concept, and I think it's a possible route for Africa to industrialize whilst leapfrogging a conventional fossil fuel model. I see it as a very good fit into our definition of a just transition, whereby the developed world helps Africa leapfrog the sort of conventional development model and move to a situation where we could industrialize using green hydrogen, and indeed we could be a source of export for green hydrogen. So with that, let me stop and hand back to you, Sonia. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think it was so important to get your perspective. And, you know, we had the Financing Commons Summit just last week, and some of us hoped that that might add a few extra reliable and predictable sources of adaptation finance. And it didn't quite, but we still have the Global Summit of Adaptation next year, and other opportunities to try and make that happen. I now want to turn to Graham Watkins from the Inter-American Development Bank over in DC. You're head of the climate change division there. It would be really good to hear your perspective, if briefly as possible, 5-6 minutes, in terms of what you're doing to ensure a greener recovery in the Latin American Caribbean region. How can you align your COVID-19 response to the Paris Agreement, bring those two together, and what country engagement work are you doing to make sure that we do indeed deliver on a greener economic path after the COVID-19 crisis? Graham, over to you. And if you could just keep it as brief as possible, because we've got about 20 minutes left of the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And for most of you, probably know that I'm Amalie's next person in line, as it were. So I should be able to continue the discourse that Amalie started. I would say right out the offset, just as Norbert and Guy and others have indicated, that we're still right in the middle of the crisis in Latin America. And it's being added to by the climate crisis. As we've seen now, 2 hurricanes have run straight into Central America, and that is creating a whole new demand for financing within the bank itself. I also want to say that we're also at the point now of really thinking about the future beyond the direct management of the crisis, beyond what is often referred to as the rescue phase, towards a sustainable recovery phase. And we have been moving what we call our climate change action plan, which will run from 2021 to 2025 through the bank systems, and it should get approved this year. And what that tries to do is actually align the climate agenda with the COVID agenda and bring them together and bring them together around sustainable recovery. I will say that in the short term, by short term, I refer to probably the next year, potentially next year or two, we are going to be focusing on policy loans and how do we incorporate sustainability into policy loans so that we can build for the future recovery. We have some very good examples of that. The classic example is the one that we did in Costa Rica, which is all about decarbonization and basically is building directly for the future, but then was used for COVID response. But there are other very good examples. We're working directly with Barbados on what we have done one on resilience, which is their roof to reef program. And we've also worked with Bahamas on a blue economy approach. And we have about 5 more in the pipeline right now that we're looking at. So part of our response is going to be building through these loans, policy loans, for the future. I think the longer term really still needs to focus on jobs and economic growth. There's no choice around it. And I do want to draw attention to a publication that we released with ILO, which does actually point out that you can create jobs over the coming years if you decarbonize. And I think that that's an important step forward, and it's an important messaging that we need to really emphasize. We don't need to stick with the business as usual and what we've been doing in the past. We can actually change and create new jobs. The focus of our work is going to be very heavily on social resilience. Really, how do we build resilience into communities, into systems? They're looking at innovative things like cash transfers for directly for social protection that can be part of systems, but also resilient housing and changing the way we build housing, green buildings, etc. We're also going to be really driving forward our agenda on sustainable infrastructure. And that, for multiple reasons, will actually provide jobs, but also bring in private investment as well. And that's a key element of what we're going to be doing in the future. And that covers energy, transportation, the transformation in those systems, water and sanitation for its resilience functions, but also digitalization as well, which is also going to be critical in the future. And as Amalie mentioned, this whole agenda of natural capital, nature-based solutions is critical. That is part of the infrastructure agenda, both for resilience and for mitigation, just to be clear on that. But to make this stuff stick, and this is a lesson learned from recovery packages in the past, you have to fix the policy systems. You're going to have to look at what the public-private agendas are, the risk management in those agendas. You're going to have to think about the transition itself, ensuring it's just, but also ensuring you're not creating stranded assets for the future and not locking in particular systems right now. And you can actually flip some systems to generate additional revenue, fiscal revenue, through green tax systems, but also reduce spending by removing fossil fuel subsidies, for example. Finally, I think as Amelie really drew attention to, and everybody's drawn attention to, the private sector have to be fully engaged. But to do that, the public sector needs to create the space for that to happen. And that means doing things like advancing sustainable infrastructure taxonomies. We've been working on this both in Brazil and in Mexico, all the way across to creating either both subnational and national sovereign green bonds that are, or thematic bonds that can be used to group and pool private finance and then apply that, but apply that for things like sustainable infrastructure. Particularly, this is a challenge, again, in Brazil and Mexico and larger countries at a subnational level. In terms of our engagement on the ground, actually, we've taken a decision, in essence, and I think Norbert mentioned this at the beginning, to decentralize most of our staff to countries, so that they can actually work directly with the representatives in the countries and directly with the governments in the countries around this agenda. What we've seen is a huge demand, but it also will actually it'll do multiple things. It'll reduce our costs. We won't be traveling back and forth, but we'll actually be able to build relationships and build close relationships in the countries. It also allows us to expand the sphere of our actions. We've learned a lot of lessons from Costa Rica, from our work in Chile, from the work in Peru, Colombia, and in the Caribbean and Barbados and Bahamas. But now we need to start moving that agenda as quickly as possible to other countries. Obviously, and I will say this at the outset, larger countries are going to be much more complex than smaller countries. I think there is a recipe for action in small countries that can work. In larger countries, I do think the agenda is going to be very much around this question of sustainable infrastructure, investment taxonomies, PPPs, and all those kinds of things. And with smaller countries, we have the best example, I think, in the world. And I would draw your attention to the fact that the president is going to be launching a cost-benefit analysis of decarbonization next week, president of Costa Rica. So this stuff is moving, and it's moving very well in some countries. I just think, sort of in summary, I think we need to draw attention to the fact, as everyone has, we're still in the midst of the emergency. However, I think there is light. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And a lot of people are saying that. Now you can actually, well, okay, I can see where I'm going in the future. We can also see what the elements of that future needs to include, and that's clarifying. It's going to be complex, though. There's a lot of political economy questions that are going to have to be answered at a country level. And this is why I think this focus at a country level on what are the solutions within a particular country are going to be critical. How can you advance the agenda in a particular country? Because it's not going to be the same in Costa Rica as it is in Barbados. They're going to be different. And we know that already. And I think the key for the MDBs is, how do we connect up all the dots in a country? How do we make sure the knowledge, policy, planning, programming, dialogue agenda matches the climate finance, this concessional climate finance agenda, our technical assistance, the access to external funds agenda, and the mobilization agenda to our own operations? How do we bring that all together to really leverage change? So that I'll stop there with that final message, but that, I think, is the real challenge for the future.
And I think that is a really important point for you to end on. You know, we do need to increase the volumes of concessional climate finance going to the least developed countries, but also the middle income countries. And that's something that we at E3G are very focused on, and something we really want to do something about over this next year. Thank you so much. Now I want to turn to Kristin Schweisgut from the Heinrich Boll Foundation, a German political foundation. Your program director of Infrastructure and Development Bank in the foundation's office in Washington, D.C. So I was wondering if you could almost be a bit more political than maybe some of our colleagues from the MDBs themselves, which are obviously not political institutions at all. Can be, and talk a bit more about what this means for the World Bank and the IMF. Do we need a new Bretton Woods system coming out of this crisis? And how do you expect the new Biden administration will influence the work of these institutions in the coming weeks, months, years, with respect to the need for a global, green, better and more just and resilient recovery to the COVID-19 crisis? So Kristin, if I can hand over to you just to be 5 minutes max, if possible, to give your thoughts on those points.
Thank you, Sonia, for the kind introduction. I'm glad to be here today and to be on this panel. With regard to your questions, some of the previous speakers, such as Summerlee and Graham, have mentioned before that the participation of the private sector in debt relief is key. And this is also true for the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank rightly says that if the private sector won't engage, then for the public sector to offer debt relief does not help poor countries, but simply subsidizes the private sector who won't give debt relief. So the question is, how can the World Bank and the IMF lead the way to incentivize the private sector to give debt relief? And at the Heinrich Böll Foundation, what we advocate for is a debt relief that includes a mandatory participation from the private sector. In the report that we have published this month, together with the Boston University and the University of London, we suggest that private creditors participating in the debt restructuring would swap their old debt holdings with a haircut for new green recovery bonds. So that this allows the developing and emerging market countries to create fiscal space for spending in health, social spending, and for climate adaptation spending. Being based in Washington, D.C., of course, we closely followed the election, and we expect that regarding Biden's track record and his stated commitments, that he will seek to renew trust in American international engagement and leadership. And this will have repercussions on the MDB world as well. He is a supporter, he's a declared supporter of international organizations and alliances. And he is committed to achieving net carbon zero by 2050. So I am convinced that in the MDB world, this will not only be felt as a change in tone, but also in concrete actions. So especially at the World Bank Group, where the United States are still the largest shareholder with 18% paid in capital, the new administration will mark a decisive change. Thank you.
Brilliant, and it's great to hear your report with the very specific proposals on how to try and address this challenge. And indeed, I know there was a report published last week from the UN Economic Commission for Africa with some further ideas that is well worth reading. So thank you so much, and thank you for bringing that perspective. So before we answer some of the questions in the chat, I wanted to go back to something that Gareth mentioned actually, which was the process that the 9 leading multilateral development banks are going through to align all their operations with the Paris Agreement. He mentioned building block 4, which I think is the engagement and policy support building block, one of 6 different parts of that approach. And I wanted to bring in Nancy Sage from the EIB, one of the leading MDBs when it comes to climate change and Paris alignment, to maybe just give us a bit of an update on that process, and then specifically also how it can be, how the MDB responses to the COVID-19 crisis can be Paris aligned, and how do we bring the framework that is emerging on that side together with the huge accelerated volume of lending in response to the crisis together, basically. Nancy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Just checking, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can, loud and clear. Yeah.
So thank you very much. Yes, the MDBs have been working as a group on Paris alignment since they made their announcement about their framework for that at Katowice. And it's extremely relevant for a green recovery. You talked earlier, several people talked about building back better. Obviously, the pandemic is a massive crisis, but it's only one particular shock amongst many shocks which poorer countries and vulnerable people are experiencing. This is a health and a social and employment and economic shock. But meanwhile, the environmental crisis, the climate crisis is still going on and is impacting. So when we talk about Build Back Better, it has to be focused on building back better to multiple shocks. And I think that the Paris alignment concept of the MDBs is very good for that. I think the other thing worth mentioning in that context is also the principles for mainstreaming climate in financial institutions, which actually predates because it was announced at the Paris COP. And that also covers really how a whole organization can try and change what it's doing. And I think several people have highlighted how we cannot turn away from the climate crisis while dealing with the terrible social and health impacts of COVID. And so, in fact, the MDBs have made clear that their framework for Paris alignment is adequate, as we believe, for all approaches that we have to do, whether we're dealing with COVID or whether we're dealing with another crisis which may occur. It looks at both what you need to do more of and what you need to do less of. It looks at both the mitigation side and the resilience side. And importantly, as Gareth mentioned, it looks at what our clients are doing. Now, some of those are countries, and obviously NDC work and long-term strategy work can be done by MDBs, but at the same time looking at the COVID crisis and making sure that the plans are compatible. But many people also mentioned the private sector, and I do think that it's worth highlighting that Building Block 4 is about all kinds of clients. So in terms of businesses, we have a duty as MDBs to work with our clients, whether they're big corporates or whether they're local banks who are reaching out to the smallest businesses. In all these cases, we have a duty and a role to work with them and help them, our clients, have better resilience plans and better decarbonisation plans. And I think that our framework really highlights the need for that. It also obviously highlights the need for more accelerated climate finance, green finance, to not only just provide more finance, but mobilize more private finance for projects, help clients develop more projects, help clients implement those projects. And that leads me to the last thing I want to say is all of this, I think, is a sea change in how MDBs work, because it's really about taking the idea of mainstreaming climate to a step further, where you start from the premise of this enormous crisis that the world is facing, and then say, we have to keep that in place while dealing with everything else that's happening, while dealing with the debt crisis, while dealing with the jobs crisis, with the humanitarian crisis of COVID, or whatever else comes along. And I absolutely echo Graham's idea about, we have to think about how to create jobs. How do we support the creation of jobs, which are green, which are based on energy efficiency, which are based on restoring nature? How can we tackle these two big issues, or even more big issues, at the same time? And so we strongly believe that the work we're doing is fit for purpose for dealing with COVID. I mean, it's not easy by any means, but that's what the MDBs are working on. We started with direct financing. We're now working on more looking at Paris alignment in intermediated financing, in policy loans, which Graham also mentioned, looking at different types of clients and how we can help them. And all of this, we think, should allow us to continue working on COVID while making sure that we're not slipping back on addressing the climate challenge. Thank you.
And it's so important that does happen kind of across the institution, doesn't it? And different bits of the institutions need to be working off the same hymn sheet. Maybe I can just squeeze in one question, maybe two, before we really close. This one's actually for Graham from the IDB. What is your definition of what a green policy loan really is, and how are the policy conditions of these loans negotiated? And DPL lending is obviously something that's been really ramped up in response to the crisis. So do you have any specifics you could quickly give the audience on that?
In responding directly to the specific question, do we have anything directly published on this and readily available? Not yet. We do have internal documentation that provides guidance, and we've done a series of discussions directly with our representatives on what you might be able to include into those policy loans. Some policy loans are directly sustainability related. The decarbonization one in Costa Rica is relatively easy. One in Peru that we've been working on is more about the competitive strategy of the country and the plan, the competitiveness plan of the country. And that one is a little bit more tricky, but what we tried to do is to insert into that changes in policy that then would support sustainability in the future. As everyone's probably aware, that to actually be able to do this effectively, you need those policy discussions already going on sometime before you actually develop the policy loan. So one of the ideas that we have is, one of the things we're going to be doing is, by decentralizing people, those policy discussions can become stronger and therefore be incorporated into future loans. We also have a publication that builds on the World Bank work that was done on what makes a good investment, in the time of COVID. We have not yet published that, but we have it as internal guidance at the moment.
Very interesting. And then I just want to, in one more minute, just squeeze in two more of the questions. And Norbert, I'd really like to come to you on these. There's one question about, well, can climate finance practitioners influence what guidance shareholders give to these institutions as they feel there's no democratic access to? That's a very broad question, but also just to see if you have any thoughts on the question around export credit agencies and, you know, what role they have in building back better. And to note that we, you know, about a dozen export credit agencies for the first time ever last week committed to Paris alignment. And what does that mean for them? So Norbert, do you have any thoughts on either of those two questions?
Yes, thank you. Quickly on both questions. First, what can climate finance practitioners do? I think they should work either with the clients or the shareholders in order to influence that and makes a point very clear. They can also, if necessary, work with campaigners if needed, but I think the most easiest way would be to work with the clients. So the finance ministries of the partner countries are normally addressing the MDBs, and if they come with a very clear request, then I would like to see the MDB which would say no to such a request, which would be asking for a strong climate action. And if that's coming more and more from practitioners, I'm sure it will have an influence. But they can also, as I said, they can also work with the shareholders, which are sometimes also the clients, but also, of course, the big donor countries. On the other question, yes, I think it's absolutely crucial that export credit agencies also become aligned. And the first thing we are working on with is to have very clear outlisting of certain activities which are not aligned. So we still have the fight on to what extent should export credit agencies or export credit support supporting investments in fossil fuel investments, whatever it is. So that's the discussion at the moment. And then, of course, from that, you have to take it further to other areas, to other sustainability areas, etc.
Yeah, and there is growing consensus around that, around what activities are not aligned with the Paris Agreement around the world, and that's great to see.
Let me also mention biodiversity here. I think that's also coming up now very strongly. Activities which are not aligned with protecting biodiversity, and biodiversity losses also are a fiscal risk, and that's becoming more and more clear.
Yeah, absolutely. All
Sonia,
right,
can I just say something on that? I know you're over time, but very quickly to say, I've been working for the last 2 years on the EU taxonomy. Now, I know that's an EU taxonomy for green investments, but one of its most revolutionary points is that it says that something cannot be counted as a green investment unless it's making a substantial contribution to one objective, but are also doing no significant harm to the others, including biodiversity, but also circular economy, adaptation, etc. So in other words, what it's saying is you also have to meet minimum social safeguards. And I think this is a wind of change in the green finance industry, because it's saying if you want to count something as green, it's got to be making a real effort towards something green. but it must not be undermining the other objectives. And so absolutely underlining the point that Norbert just made about biodiversity. There is no point in having climate mitigation investments if they're not resilient, if they're undermining biodiversity efforts, if they're undermining circular economy, etc. So I really think that even though it's an EU taxonomy, it's a wake-up call for this much more integrated look at different environmental impacts.
And indeed, you know, these institutions have a role to play in adapting that taxonomy around the world. I'm afraid we really do need to wrap it up now. We're 5 minutes over. It was great to have you all here talking about this, building consensus, talking about the way forward. It was great to have so many participants as well. Thank you so much all for joining, for your questions. If we didn't get to them, we will try and answer them in the follow-up email. The recording will be sent out to everyone shortly, together with also put on the internet. So feel free to promote it there. Do also check out E3G's Public Bank Climate Tracker Matrix. It's on our website. It's an interactive, constantly updated tool with our approach, our detailed approach to Paris alignment and our assessment of Paris alignment at the 8 leading multilaterals. And we hope to add more and more bilaterals to that as well as the months and years go by. Thank you all for joining. Have a good rest of your London Climate Action Week, a good rest of your day wherever you are in the world, and hope to be in touch with you soon. Bye, everyone. Bye.